On a quiet December morning in the year 2004, the city of Knoxville, Tennessee, was still wrapped in darkness. The early hours before dawn are usually uneventful, a time when streets rest and the world feels paused. But inside a small apartment near the University of Tennessee campus, a young woman's life was about to be violently and tragically altered. Her name was Johnia Berry. Johnia was 21 years old, a graduate student with a future that seemed carefully planned and full of promise. She had recently moved to Knoxville to continue her studies in psychology, driven by a desire to understand the human mind and help others navigate their struggles. Friends described her as warm, intelligent, and deeply focused on her goals. She was the kind of person who planned ahead, who believed effort would be rewarded, who trusted that the world made sense if you followed the rules. That belief would be shattered in the early hours of December 6th. Johnia shared her apartment with a roommate, and by all accounts, the night before had been ordinary. There were no warnings, no signs of danger, nothing that suggested that this night would end in violence. The neighborhood was familiar, the apartment secure, and like countless other students, Johnia went to sleep believing she was safe. Sometime before morning, an intruder entered the apartment. Investigators would later determine that the motive may not have been personal. There was no known connection between Johnia and the person who came through that door. No prior relationship, no argument, no history. What unfolded was not the result of a long-standing conflict, but rather a sudden and devastating act of opportunity. The sound of movement inside the apartment woke Johnia and her roommate. What followed was confusion, fear, and chaos. In the darkness, a violent confrontation occurred. Johnia's roommate was injured but managed to escape the apartment. Bleeding and terrified, he ran into the cold night, seeking help from a nearby convenience store. From there, he called emergency services, his voice urgent as he tried to explain what had just happened. Inside the apartment complex, Johnia was still alive. Despite her injuries, she fought to survive. In a final act of determination, she made her way out of the apartment, knocking on doors, trying to get anyone to respond. Neighbors would later say they heard knocking but did not immediately realize the severity of the situation. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Johnia Berry died from her injuries shortly afterward. The city of Knoxville woke up that morning to the news of a brutal crime committed against a young graduate student just steps away from campus. Fear spread quickly through the community. Parents called their children. Students locked their doors. Questions filled the air. Who would do this? Why her? And how could something so violent happen in a place that felt so ordinary? Law enforcement launched an intensive investigation. The crime scene was processed carefully, and evidence was collected. Detectives worked around the clock, interviewing neighbors, reviewing timelines, and searching for any clue that could point them toward the person responsible. Among the evidence collected was DNA, a crucial detail that would later become central to the case. But in the days, weeks, and months that followed, no arrest was made. Johnia Berry's case went cold. For her family, the pain did not fade with time. Her mother and loved ones refused to let her name disappear into a forgotten case file. They spoke publicly, pushing for attention, accountability, and justice. Johnia was not just a victim, she was a daughter, a student, and a young woman whose future had been stolen. As the investigation stalled, one haunting truth remained: the person responsible was still out there. And for nearly 3 years, that person lived freely. Here on Dark Psyche Case Files, we explore not just what happened, but why cases like this expose the darkest corners of the human mind. If stories like this matter to you, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss future deep dive case files. In the next chapter, we will follow the investigation as it grows cold, examine the unanswered questions, and reveal how a single piece of evidence would eventually change everything. In the days following Johnia Berry's death, the atmosphere in Knoxville shifted. What had once felt like a familiar college town suddenly carried an undercurrent of fear. Students moved in groups. Doors were double-checked. Parents called more often. The idea that a stranger could enter an apartment and commit such an act without warning left the community unsettled. For investigators, the pressure was immediate and intense. The Knoxville Police Department assembled a task force dedicated to Johnia's case. Detectives retraced her final hours, reconstructing her movements and routines. They spoke to friends, classmates, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen or heard something unusual that night. Every detail, no matter how small, was logged, reviewed, and revisited. One of the first conclusions investigators reached was that Johnia had not been targeted personally. There was no evidence of stalking, no prior threats, and no known disputes. Her lifestyle showed no signs of high-risk behavior. This pointed investigators toward a theory that the crime was random, possibly the result of a burglary that escalated into violence. That theory was both troubling and complicated. If the attack was random, it meant the suspect could be anyone. There was no clear suspect pool, no obvious motive, and no personal connection to trace. Random crimes are often the most difficult to solve because they lack emotional patterns or predictable behaviors. Still, detectives pressed on. The crime scene yielded important evidence, including DNA. At the time, forensic technology was advanced enough to preserve it, but not advanced enough to immediately identify a suspect without a matching profile already in the system. The DNA was entered into law enforcement databases, and investigators waited. And waited. Weeks turned into months. Leads came in from the public, many fueled by fear rather than facts. Some callers reported suspicious strangers. Others named people they simply did not trust. Each tip had to be investigated, consuming time and resources. None led to a breakthrough. As time passed, attention faded. Media coverage slowed. New crimes replaced old headlines. But for Johnia's family, time did not soften the loss. Her mother, Carol Berry, became one of the strongest voices pushing for justice. She refused to let the case disappear into obscurity. She attended hearings, spoke to lawmakers, and met with investigators, determined to ensure her daughter's death would not be forgotten. What made the situation even more painful was the knowledge that the evidence existed. Somewhere in a database was the key to identifying the person responsible. But without a match, the case remained suspended between knowing and proving. Behind the scenes, detectives continued to review the file. They revisited evidence, re-examined witness statements, and evaluated new forensic techniques as they became available. Still, progress was slow. Johnia Berry's case officially became what law enforcement calls a cold case, meaning there were no active leads, but the investigation was never closed. Then, nearly 3 years after the crime, something changed. In the late summer of the year 2007, a man named Taylor Lee Olson was arrested in Knoxville for an unrelated offense. As part of standard procedure for violent felony arrests, his DNA was collected and entered into the system. This was routine, administrative, and at the time, unremarkable. But when Olson's DNA profile was processed, it triggered a match. The DNA collected from Johnia Berry's apartment matched Taylor Lee Olson. For investigators who had spent years waiting, the match was immediate and undeniable. The evidence that had sat silently in storage now had a name attached to it. The suspect was no longer unknown. Law enforcement moved quickly. Olson was charged with murder and additional related offenses. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community and reignited media attention around the case. After years of uncertainty, there was finally a person to hold accountable. But as the legal process began, the story took another devastating turn. Before Olson could stand trial, before evidence could be presented in court, And before a jury could hear the full account of what happened inside that apartment, Olson died while in custody. His death meant there would be no trial, no verdict, no courtroom answers. For Johnia's family, justice once again felt just out of reach. The DNA match confirmed responsibility in the eyes of investigators, but without a conviction, the case ended without the closure many hoped for. Still, Johnia Berry's story did not end there. Her death would go on to influence changes in the law, reshaping how DNA is collected and used in violent crime investigations. In a way, her legacy extended beyond her life, helping prevent future cases from remaining unsolved as long as hers did. Here on Dark Psyche Case Files, stories like this remind us that the justice system does not always deliver neat endings. If you believe these stories deserve to be told, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. In the next chapter, we will explore the legal aftermath, the impact on Johnia's family, and how her case changed state law forever. The arrest of Taylor Lee Olson brought a complicated mix of relief and renewed pain. For investigators, the DNA match validated years of unanswered questions. For Johnia Berry's family, it confirmed what they had long believed, that the person responsible for her death could be identified. But the confirmation came with a heavy cost. There would be no trial, no public testimony, no moment where the full truth would be laid out before a jury. The legal process ended before it truly began. Without a courtroom proceeding, many details remained sealed within investigative files. For the public, the story felt unfinished. For Johnia's family, it felt deeply unfair. They had waited nearly 3 years for answers, only to be denied the chance to see justice carried out in the traditional sense. Yet even in the absence of a trial, the evidence told its own story. Investigators were clear in their conclusions. The DNA evidence linked Olson directly to the crime scene. There was no ambiguity in the forensic results. In the eyes of law enforcement, responsibility had been established beyond reasonable doubt. Still, the justice system operates on procedure, and without a living defendant, the case could not move forward. As the news settled, attention turned toward something larger than a single case. Johnia Berry's mother refused to let her daughter's death be reduced to a tragic footnote. She recognized a critical flaw exposed by the investigation. At the time of the murder, DNA collection laws were limited. If Olson's DNA had been collected earlier for prior offenses, the match could have been made sooner. Johnia's case might have been solved before years passed. That realization became a turning point. Johnia's family began advocating for legislative change. They worked alongside lawmakers, law enforcement officials, and victim advocacy groups to push for broader DNA collection policies. The goal was simple but powerful: ensure that people arrested for violent felonies have their DNA collected immediately, not years later. Their efforts gained traction. In the year 2007, Tennessee passed legislation that would become known as the Johnia Berry Act. The law expanded DNA collection requirements, giving investigators a stronger tool to solve violent crimes more quickly. It was a direct response to the delays that plagued Johnia's case. Through that law, her name became associated not only with tragedy, but with reform. For many families affected by violent crime, Johnia's story became a symbol of resilience. It showed how loss could be transformed into action, and how one voice, amplified by determination, could change the system. Still, the emotional weight never disappeared. Friends and classmates remembered Johnia as more than a case file. She was a student who believed in understanding others, a daughter who stayed connected to her family, a young woman who had plans, dreams, and a future that was never given the chance to unfold. Her story also forced a broader conversation about safety, randomness, and vulnerability. The idea that an ordinary night could end in violence challenged assumptions people held about security and control. It reminded communities that danger does not always announce itself, and that prevention often depends on systems working efficiently behind the scenes. Here on Dark Psyche Case Files, we don't just tell stories of crime, we examine the psychological and systemic forces that allow them to happen. If this case has made you think differently about justice and accountability, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button to support the channel. In the next chapter, we will take a deeper look at the psychological profile of the crime, the unanswered questions that still linger, and how cases without trials leave lasting echoes behind. As time passed, the Johnia Berry case began to occupy a unique space in the collective memory of those who followed it. It was no longer only about identifying who committed the crime. It became about the absence of answers that a trial would have provided, and the psychological weight that unresolved questions place on families, investigators, and communities. When a case ends without testimony, there is no narrative officially established in a courtroom. There is no opportunity to hear motives explored, actions reconstructed step by step, or responsibility acknowledged in words. Instead, what remains is silence, filled only by evidence and conclusions that never get publicly tested. This absence can be deeply unsettling. In Johnia's case, investigators were confident in their findings, but the public never heard a detailed account from the person responsible. This left space for speculation, something that families of victims often find painful. Speculation does not bring clarity, it prolongs grief. From a psychological standpoint, crimes like this raise difficult questions. When violence appears random, people naturally search for patterns that may not exist. Was the intruder watching the apartment beforehand, or was it truly a moment of opportunity? Was the intent theft from the start, or did panic escalate the situation? These questions remain unanswered, not because investigators failed, but because the legal process was cut short. What can be said with certainty is that the crime showed no evidence of personal targeting. That detail matters. Crimes driven by personal motives often follow emotional histories. Random acts, by contrast, reveal something colder and more unpredictable. They challenge the assumption that we can always identify danger through warning signs. For students and residents in Knoxville, this reality lingered long after the headlines faded. Universities reviewed safety protocols. Apartment complexes adjusted security measures. Awareness campaigns encouraged vigilance without promoting fear. The goal was balance, acknowledging risk while preserving normal life. Johnia Berry's story became a teaching point in criminal justice and psychology discussions, not as a spectacle, but as a case study in how evidence, law, and timing intersect. It showed how one missing procedure can delay justice, and how one legislative change can improve outcomes for countless future cases. Yet behind every policy discussion was a family still living with loss. Johnia's mother continued to speak publicly, not out of anger but out of responsibility. She emphasized that her daughter was not defined by how she died, but by how she lived. She spoke about Johnia's compassion, her curiosity, and her belief in helping others understand themselves. Those who listened were reminded that victims are never just statistics. For true crime audiences, stories like this demand restraint. They require care, accuracy, and respect. Sensationalism distorts reality and distracts from the real lessons. That is why, here on Dark Psyche Case Files, the focus remains on truth, context, and the psychological undercurrents beneath the crime. If you value thoughtful, responsible storytelling, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button so this channel can continue bringing carefully researched case files to a wider audience. In the next chapter, we will reflect on Johnia Berry's lasting legacy, the changes her case inspired, and what it reveals about justice, memory, and the human need for closure. Years after the early morning hours of December 6th in the year 2004, the name Johnia Berry continues to carry weight far beyond the walls of the apartment where her life was taken. Some cases fade quietly, absorbed into statistics and forgotten files. Others leave marks that ripple outward, influencing systems, policies, and conversations long after the headlines disappear. Johnia's case belongs firmly in the latter. The absence of a courtroom trial left a void that could never be filled by legal procedure alone. There was no verdict read aloud, no closing arguments, no moment when responsibility was formally acknowledged before a judge and jury. Instead, what remained was evidence, certainty within law enforcement, and a family forced to accept a version of justice that arrived incomplete. Yet even without a trial, the truth of what happened refused to vanish. For many who followed the case closely, Johnia Berry became a symbol of something larger than a single crime. She represented the consequences of delayed systems, the cost of gaps in policy, and the reality that justice often depends on timing as much as effort. Her case highlighted how modern forensic tools are only effective when they are allowed to work as intended. The Johnia Berry Act did more than change procedures. It changed expectations. Before the law was passed, DNA collection was inconsistent, limited by thresholds that left dangerous gaps. Afterward, violent felony arrests triggered immediate DNA collection, closing loopholes that had allowed offenders to move undetected. This shift did not guarantee that every crime would be solved, but it significantly reduced the likelihood that evidence would sit unused, waiting for a future arrest to catch up with the past. For families of victims across Tennessee, this change carried meaning. It represented acknowledgement. It said that what happened to Johnia mattered enough to reshape the system, that her life, though cut short, would influence how future lives might be protected. In psychological terms, legacy is often how humans make sense of loss. When tragedy cannot be undone, meaning becomes a form of survival. Johnia's family transformed grief into advocacy, ensuring that her name would be associated not only with what was taken, but with what was changed. Still, the emotional toll never fully lifted. Grief does not operate on a timeline. It does not resolve simply because a law is passed or a suspect is named. For Johnia's loved ones, milestones came with absence. Birthdays passed without calls. Achievements went unshared. Futures imagined were quietly rewritten. This is the reality behind every true crime case, a reality often lost when stories are reduced to timelines and outcomes. Johnia Berry was not remembered by her family as a victim first. She was remembered as a daughter who laughed easily, as a student driven by curiosity, as someone who believed in understanding people rather than judging them. The irony of her studying psychology is not lost on those who reflect on her life. She sought insight into the human mind, yet became the subject of one of its darkest expressions. For audiences drawn to true crime, cases like this demand reflection. They ask why we listen, what we seek, and what responsibility comes with telling these stories. When handled carelessly, true crime can become exploitative. When handled with intention, it becomes educational, memorializing, and even preventative. That is the approach here on Dark Psyche Case Files. This channel exists not to sensationalize, but to document, not to glorify violence, but to understand its roots and consequences. Each case file is a reminder that behind every headline is a human life, and behind every statistic is a story that deserves care. If you believe thoughtful storytelling matters, take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your support helps keep these case files respectful, accurate, and focused on truth rather than shock. As time moves forward, Johnia Berry's story continues to surface in classrooms, policy discussions, and victim advocacy circles. It stands as a reminder that justice is not only about punishment, but about prevention, not only about answers, but about improvement. In the second part of this chapter, We will reflect on the lasting cultural impact of the case, how unresolved endings shape public memory, and why stories like Johnia's continue to resonate years later, long after the crime itself has faded from the news cycle. As the years continue to pass, the story of Johnia Berry remains present in ways that are quiet but enduring. It does not linger through constant headlines or repeated media cycles. Instead, it exists in something deeper, in policy manuals, in advocacy work, in the memories of those who refuse to let her name disappear. This is often how real legacy forms, not loudly, but persistently. Unresolved cases, or cases without trials, leave a distinct psychological imprint on the public. Humans are wired to seek endings. We look for conclusions that tie events together, that offer moral clarity and emotional resolution. When a story stops without that final chapter in court, the mind keeps returning to it, searching for what was never spoken aloud. In Johnia's case, the absence of a trial meant the story had no official narrator. There was no testimony to reconstruct the night, no explanation offered by the person responsible, no moment where accountability was verbally claimed. Instead, the narrative exists through evidence, investigation, and inference. For some, that is enough. For others, it never will be. This tension is not unusual in true crime, but it is particularly pronounced in cases where guilt is established through science rather than confession or conviction. DNA does not speak. It confirms presence, contact, and responsibility, but it does not explain motive or state of mind. It answers the question of who, but not the question of why. And why is often what people want most. The lack of motive in this case reinforces its most unsettling element. There was no personal history, no known connection, no emotional trigger that could be traced backward. This randomness challenges the belief that danger can always be anticipated or avoided through behavior alone. It reminds us that systems matter, that prevention is often collective rather than individual. For universities and student communities across the country, Johnia Berry's case became part of safety discussions, not as a source of fear, but as a call to preparedness. Lighting, access control, awareness training, and emergency response protocols were reevaluated in many places. While no measure can eliminate risk entirely, each improvement represents a step toward reducing vulnerability. From a broader cultural perspective, Johnia's story also reflects how society remembers victims. Some names fade because no one carries them forward. Others endure because someone insists they must. In this case, remembrance was driven by a mother's determination and a family's refusal to accept silence. Johnia Berry's life was not defined by violence. It was defined by intention. She chose a field centered on understanding others. She believed knowledge could ease suffering. Though her life ended too soon, that belief continues to echo through the changes her case inspired. True crime storytelling carries responsibility precisely because of stories like this. It is easy to focus on the shock of what happened. It is harder and more important to focus on what remains afterward. The grief, the reforms, the lessons, the human cost that does not disappear when the cameras turn away. Here on Dark Psyche Case Files, the goal has always been to slow the narrative down, to resist exaggeration, to let facts speak without distortion, and to remember that behind every case file is a life that mattered long before it became a story. Johnia Berry mattered. She mattered to her family, to her friends, to her academic community, and to countless people who never met her but were impacted by the changes her case set in motion. Her name now exists not only in memory, but in law, a rare and powerful transformation of loss into protection. As listeners and viewers, engaging with stories like this also carries weight. Choosing to listen thoughtfully, to comment respectfully, and to support responsible storytelling helps shape the future of this genre. If you believe these stories deserve care and depth, remember to like this video, leave a comment, and hit the subscribe button. Your engagement allows Dark Psyche Case Files to continue documenting cases with integrity rather than sensationalism. In the end, justice does not always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through policy change, awareness, and prevention. Sometimes it arrives incomplete, but memory, when preserved with intention, becomes its own form of accountability. Johnia Berry's story remains unfinished in the legal sense, but it continues to speak. In classrooms, in legislation, and in the minds of those who believe that telling the truth carefully still matters. And as long as her name is spoken with respect, her story is not over.